Thank you for joining us for this sermon podcast from United Christian Church of Austin, where no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're invited and welcome. This sermon for Sunday, March 4th, 2018, continues in our Lenten sermon series, Letting Go, Living Into, with letting go of law and living into grace. It's a reflection on a reading from the Gospel according to John, chapter 7, verse 53, through chapter 8, verse 11. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to learn more about our open and affirming ministries at United Christian Church, simply head over to our website, www.uccaustin.org. Thank you.
Then each of them went home while Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now the law of Moses commands us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let everyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I. I do not condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." Friends, God is still speaking to the world. Let us open our hearts to respond, to listen, and to respond. Amen.
So who here has heard of the Myers-Briggs personality test? Most of the people in the room here. Who has taken it before, or a version of it before? Okay, so most of you are familiar with this, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with this assessment, the Myers-Briggs personality test is an introspective self-report questionnaire. And the purpose of the questionnaire is to identify psychological preferences in how people perceive the world around them and how they make decisions. 4 basic dichotomies are evaluated to see where a person might show preferences and then to what degree. So, for example, do you prefer to focus on the outer world, extroversion, or your own inner world, introversion? Do you prefer to focus on basic information that you take in, that is sensing, or do you prefer to interpret and add meaning, intuition? When you make decisions, do you prefer to first look at logic and consistency, thinking, or do you first look at the people and the special circumstances, feeling? And finally, in dealing with the outside world, do you prefer to get things decided, judging, or do you prefer to stay open to new information and opinions, perceiving? The first time I took the Myers-Briggs, I was about 22 years old and I was working full-time and attending college, and I self-identified as an ESTJ. That is an extrovert, sensing, thinking, judging personality type. And since then, I have taken the Myers-Briggs or some form of it on at least 4 different occasions, and I have been all over the map with my preferences. In other words, my preferences within those dichotomies have shifted or moved over time. For example, my preference for introversion has increased. As I perceive the world around me, I report relying a little more on my intuition and my feelings than I used to. I've moved and changed in most areas except one. No matter what, every time I've taken this assessment, I've tested as a really strong J type. That is, I score extremely high and consistently towards judging. Now, unfortunately, judging is, in my opinion and others, a poor name for this preference. It has nothing to do with judging in the sense that we probably think of when we hear the word, that is, evaluating or making value statements about oneself or others. Rather, judging in the Myers-Briggs world is about how a person with this personality trait approaches life. A strong J approaches life in a structured way, creating plans and organizing their world to achieve their goals and desired results in a predictable way. So, as a J, I like structure. I like rules. I like definite. I want to know what the decision is, and I want to stick to it. Now, please don't assume that I or other J's don't do change. Most of us are okay with change. We just need to know what we're changing, why we're changing, and exactly at what point we're changing and moving forward. A change, of course, is needed. A new decision is made. That issue is complete. It's done and over, and we move on. And most of this time, this way of dealing with the outside world serves me well. It allows me to juggle the various areas of my life as I can make quick, decisive decisions about work and home and kids and so on, and then I move on. I'm also able to tackle large, complex tasks by systematically breaking things down, creating my checklists, tackling the to-dos, and the all-important task, and my favorite, checking the item off the list. Can any of you relate? Okay, I see a few heads nodding, a few J's out there. And some going, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. I get the impression that the Pharisees and the scribes that we read about in the New Testament are probably J's as well. That is, if we were to somehow be able to go back in time and ask them to self-evaluate using this Myers-Briggs assessment, most likely they would identify as strong J's. They seem to like their structure, their rules, their definite and concrete ways of viewing and functioning in the world around them. Now, the Pharisees were a group of zealous Jewish leaders who took their faith very seriously. They believed that the way to please God and the way to make it to heaven was by meticulously following a long list of religious rules and regulations. They prided themselves on following not just the letter of the Jewish Mosaic law, but even the letter of the man-made rules designed to clarify the law. The scribes were the Jewish men who devoted themselves to the study of the law and the determination of its applications on a daily life. They were the ones that were responsible for copying down the Old Testament and drawing up legal documents when needed. Now, both groups, and sometimes members of those groups actually overlapped, but both groups appeared to have appreciated structure and rigidity. And we can see that in our story today. A group of scribes and Pharisees confront Jesus, interrupting his teaching session. They interrupt him by bringing in a woman, accusing her of committing adultery, claiming that she was actually caught in the very act. They asked Jesus whether the punishment for someone like her should be stoning, as prescribed by the Jewish Mosaic law. At first, Jesus ignores their interruption and writes on the ground as if he doesn't even hear them at all. But when the woman's accusers continue their challenge, he states that the one who is without sin is the one who should cast the first stone. The accusers and the congregants, that is, those that had been listening to Jesus' teaching, they all depart, leaving Jesus alone with this woman. And Jesus asks the woman if anyone has condemned her. And she answers that no one has done so. And Jesus says that he too does not condemn her, and he tells her to go and to sin no more. Many of the sermons that I have heard on this text focus on the horrible sin of the woman, juxtaposed against this life-giving grace of Jesus. Some sermons have gone a bit further, pointing out Jesus' equal focus on both the woman and the Jewish leaders, illustrating how Jesus treats the woman as the social and human equal of the scribes and the Pharisees, and speaking to both sets of characters about sin, offering grace to both, and inviting all the players to begin life anew in the present moment by giving up an old way and entering into a new way of life. There is a clear connection between law and grace in this story, which is probably why when I was asked to preach this week on letting go of law and living into grace as part of our Lenten series, this text immediately came to my mind. As Pastor John laid out in describing this year's Lenten theme, a big part of Lent each year is to focus on the call of Christ to examine our lives and our choices. We are invited into this set-apart time to do some introspection, to think and explore inward, to intentionally hold our lives and our choices up to the light of God's gospel of justice and peace and compassion, to notice where the shape of our lives does not conform to God's intended pattern, to give up an old way and to enter into a new way of life, to let go of law and to live into grace. So what is law? Practically speaking, law is the system of rules that a particular country or community recognizes as regulating the actions of its members. We use laws to regulate society, to protect people, to enforce rights, and to solve conflicts. Laws can also prevent or detour people from behaving in a manner that negatively affects the quality of life of another. And although we could most definitely have a very rich discussion on the laws that rule us, the ones that need to be added or removed or changed in some way, for the purposes of our consideration today, I'd like to broaden what law might mean to us internally as we think about letting go of law and living into grace. I'd like us to consider less about the concrete codified rules and regulations that we have written in law books that help us function as a society. Those laws that we employ police and judges to enforce and lawyers to prosecute or defend. Instead, I'd like for us to focus on those unspoken or sometimes spoken societal and personal laws that we and others place on our lives and on our choices. Those internal thoughts and beliefs that become very law-like or function like absolutes in our lives. Things that we let rule us, let control us or affect us. The ways we use to judge ourselves, and this time I do mean value statements about ourselves and others. Things like worrying about what people think about us or what the world says is right. Worrying about being perfect. Our fears, our supposed tos, or other evaluation statements that run through our consciousness about ourselves and others. Remember how I said my Janus helps me function in the world? Well, it also hinders me at times. Sometimes my desire for structure and rigidity and rules turns into a long list of shoulds. You should eat better. You should exercise. You should wear makeup. You should color your gray hair. You should volunteer more. You should be nicer. You should go to that rally. You should preach more. You should. Or equally as troublesome, the should not list. You should not wear that outfit. You should not think like that. You should not speak up. You should not eat that pint of Amy's After Dent ice cream mint. Ice cream. Got the order wrong, but you know what I'm talking about. It's really, really yummy. But this list of shoulds and should nots, instead of gently motivating or guiding me, easily appears very law-like, very, judgy, and becomes an overbearing, unachievable standards dictating the right way to see and engage in the world. It turns into an evaluation or performance review, all too ready to remind me of how I'm not measuring up to the world's standards, or not being the person that I, wait for it, think I should be. Sometimes I get to the end of the day and any accomplishments that I've achieved are drowned out by my should laws. And I find myself focusing on what is lacking and where I am lacking. Honestly, it can be a very life-sucking and frustrating and dark and lonely place. And I imagine that many of you can relate. So I've been on a quest of learning how to let go of these unhealthy, rigid, life-sucking laws and instead embrace grace and love and self-compassion. Recently, I've been spending a lot of time reading and rereading the works of Dr. Brené Brown. Brené Brown is a research professor in social work and an author and public speaker. She researches and writes and speaks a lot about shame and vulnerability. In her book, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live and Love and Parent and Lead, Brown describes a way of living which focuses on letting go of those things in our lives that aren't serving us well, those things that control us or hold us hostage, what I'm calling law today, and cultivating new, healthy habits that bring life, abundance, and joy, or otherwise known as grace. She calls this way wholehearted living. For Brown, wholehearted living is about engaging our lives from a place of worthiness. It means cultivating the courage and compassion and connection to wake up in the morning and think, no matter what gets done or how much is left undone, I am enough. It's going to bed at night and thinking, yes, I'm imperfect and vulnerable and sometimes afraid, but that does not change the truth that I am worthy of love and belonging. She goes on in her book to provide some guideposts for wholehearted living, and I think that they are relevant to our topic today about letting go of law and living into grace. You will notice that Brown lists her guideposts in the order of living into first, which she calls cultivating, and then she goes on to name what she's letting go of. As the image on the front of your bulletin shows, one action leads to another and then back to another. Sometimes we let go first and live into, and sometimes it's easier to live into first and then let go. There's no one way to let go and or to live into. Here are Brown's 10 guideposts. Cultivating authenticity, letting go of what people think. Cultivating self-compassion, letting go of perfectionism. Cultivating a resilient spirit, letting go of numbing and powerlessness. Cultivating gratitude and joy, letting go of scarcity and fear of the dark. Cultivating intuition and trusting faith, letting go of certainty. Cultivating creativity, letting go of comparison. Cultivating play and rest, letting go of exhaustion as a symbol status and productivity as self-worth. Cultivating calm and still, letting go of anxiety as a lifestyle. Cultivating meaningful work, letting go of self-doubt and supposed tos. Cultivating laughter, song, and dance, letting go of being cool and always in control. And although Brown provides a lot more detail in her book under each of these guideposts, at the highest level, there is this call to let go of the things that bind us like laws that we hold on ourselves, and living into a space that is filled with grace and love. The space that I believe God wants us to all find within ourselves, as well as with others and with God. And I'll admit I'm not completely there yet, but I'm working on it. So this morning, I want to close in just asking some questions, because that's what Lent's about, right? Introspection, looking inward. So my wonder questions. So as we challenge ourselves during this Lenten season to look inward on our lives and our choices, what are those things that we hold up as laws over our lives? Are they helpful? Are they life-giving? Are they love-giving? Which ones do we need to let go of? Where in our lives do we need to cultivate a new understanding, a new way of being, new measures, or maybe no measures at all? And where do we need to let go of law and live into grace?